Hey, this is David again. I wanted to do this video on sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS, also known as crib death in the East, Britain. And I always tell you when I'm an expert, when I'm not an expert. I used to be an expert in this. I haven't read on it in several years. If there'd been a discovery, you and I would have heard about that, wouldn't we? Well, there isn't a discovery. I studied sudden infant death in 3 universities, Brigham Young and Springfield College and Northeastern State University. And if you're watching because you've lost a baby, there's nothing, words don't describe my sympathy, my understanding, and my empathy. I've never lost a child yet in my life, 64 years old. I've never lost a grandchild. I'm not sure I could be alive and be watching this video. Let me first of all give a little history of sudden infant death and assure any and all parents there is no cure, there is no prevention, and it is certainly not anything to do with the parents parenting or caring for a child. Hopefully those things can be expressed to those of you that have lost a child, and certainly as a parent we feel guilty, we feel that maybe if we'd done this, maybe if we'd done that. It's not true. Sudden infant death, people don't know this, is the leading cause of death. Leading cause of death under 12 months. Boys have a higher risk, they die at a greater rate than the girls do, and the peak is right between the 2nd and 4th month. Now it can happen as quickly as days after birth, and it can happen right up to 12 months, 3 days or whatever, but it seems to have a strange window. After 12 months we don't hear about it. It doesn't seem to exist. Now it's a phenomenon that has been studied all across the world. It's been studied all through Europe, Canada, McGill University with their sensory deprivation experiments, South America, and nearly every continent, and especially the United States. It's one of the most frustrating phenomenon that American doctors face. Usually we can find out at least what's causing something, so maybe we won't be able to prevent it, but we can find out what's causing it. We can't. No doctor can. Now, if you're young and inexperienced in this area, you're going to hear breastfeeding babies don't die, babies that are laid on their back don't die, babies that have certain malnutritions, they don't die or do die. You're going to hear all kinds of false theories. Now the reason you hear those is because the men and the women who are doing research in this area want more money. They want more grants. They want to stay employed. So their abstracts and the conclusions they draw on their abstracts cause the government to look and say, well, gee, maybe they're going to find it. Gee, this one's doing good too. And they get more money. I've never been paid. I've never received a cent for research in sudden infant death. I don't intend to get paid now. And I don't want a consultation fee. I don't want you to send me money. I do this because I have a good education. I've spent a lot of time with sudden infant death syndrome, and I've seen the heartache. And if I can in some way gently let parents know, again I'm saying it to you, it's not your fault. It seems to be very objective. It does what it wants to do when it wants to do it. The history of sudden infant death goes clear back to the Bible. There's a saying in the King James Version of the Bible about overlaying. There used to be the belief that when mothers breastfed babies, it's easier to feed a baby in bed and just put your breast over there and the baby stays still and you can sleep. It was blamed for mothers laying on the babies and suffocating them. Well, back in those days, they didn't have autopsies, and so that particular excuse was used for many, many years. And of course, the mothers, I haven't been there, but I can empathize how tragic that mother would feel, that she was so negligent that she laid on her baby and the baby suffocated. So sad for so many years. Well, we came on down to more modern times, and now we have we have infinite autopsies, and all SIDS babies have to have an autopsy. And we have thousands, hundreds of thousands of autopsies on SIDS babies. They greatly, the chart shows between the 2nd and 4th month, that's when they die. The chart also shows up to 12 months, then they don't die anymore. And the chart also shows no cause of death. We know in an autopsy what a suffocation looks like. We know the larynx and the throat and the lungs and the blood. We know when a baby has been suffocated. Autopsies say no, they're not suffocated. So you moms that have laid babies on the side of the crib and they've gotten between the crib and the rails, cribs these days are not that dangerous, that had nothing to do. Now certainly sudden infant death has to be classified by a doctor and a pathologist as no cause of death. If your baby wedged its head between there and broke its neck, well obviously the autopsy will show a broken neck. Many parents, especially moms, because they're the main caregivers of the children, blame themselves. Well, gee, maybe I put the grandma's quilt over and she tangled in this and tangled in that. Believe me, I've had 14 kids, and I've been the main caretaker on most of them, other than one. And I've seen them in the crib a million times. I've seen them tangled a million times, etc., etc. And none of them died of suffocation. A baby can breathe under a blanket. Yeah, there's a lot of carbon monoxide in there, but it can still breathe. So don't blame yourselves that the baby got tangled in a blanket. If the death autopsy shows SIDS, there's not a thing in the world you could have done about it. Not a thing. Now, it has been studied all over the world, and this is what's interesting about SIDS, is that its frequency fluctuates a little bit with certain cultures. So the way a culture raises a baby, or maybe some of the things in that culture, affect the baby in such a way that there's higher incidences of sudden infant death. Now the American Indian, the Native American tribes have the most amount of sudden infant death. We don't know why. We don't know why. And that's been studied and studied. Now the societies that have the least amount of sudden infant death are Asian. Chinese, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines. Something in those cultures don't exacerbate sudden infant death, and the kids die at a less rate. Why? We don't know. Is it genetic? Is it in their body? Is it in their brain? Is it in their food system? Is it in the air? We don't know. And God knows we have studied this and studied. There's thousands and thousands of studies on SIDS. One of the things that if I could do, please, and it's important to me, is SIDS used to be, in the United States especially, linked to abuse. You must have done something to this child. It died, and there's no reason for it to die. Well, here's what's interesting about SIDS. Many, over 51% of the children were at a doctor's office within a week of their death. Well, is there something in the doctor's office that caused them to die? Certainly it wasn't mom. Why were they at the doctor's office? Well, they were there mostly for upper respiratory colds, runny nose, coughing, and the doctor says that's $125, wipe the baby's nose. So we know that something in the respiratory system and something in the breathing system has something to do with sudden infant death. What? We don't know. there's been studies on the blood, on the enzymes, the study on the amino acids, the study on what they eat, their digestive system. Good Lord, there's been every physical study in the world, and there's no answers. All we know are the generalities. American Indians have more, Native Americans, and the Asians have less. Now the statistics across the board, Russia, South America, Canada, civilized, I don't mean civilized, I mean industrial countries, compared to third world countries, we don't see a big difference in statistics. Now, there's other things that bear in on the statistics. More kids die in the winter months. In the winter months. And usually those winter months are cold weather. Massachusetts, Mongolia, and other kinds of cold weather areas. Well, that has something to do with sudden infant death. Is it the air? Is it the snow? We don't know. But there is a higher percentage that die in the winter time. So we know that there's some kind of nurture or psychological reasons for cultures bearing in, and we also know that there's some weather aberrations that bear in on sudden infant death. You're going to hear breastfed babies don't die as much, and that's why you should feel guilty because you gave your baby a bottle. That's crap. That's crap. There's been so many studies on breastfed babies and regular formula babies. It has absolutely nothing to do with sudden infant death. We know that the children always die at night. Now, I've read a few abstracts where they've died in the daytime, but they're sleeping. They're always sleeping, and most babies, after a year or so, they're going to be sleeping at night. But there are some legitimate studies that have showed babies taking naps. Moms come in 20 minutes later, the baby's dead. There's no reason for that baby to be dead, but it is dead. And I'm sure that's a hysterical, and I can't even imagine. I know how much I love my kids, and I'm a male. They didn't come out of my body, but I would die. I would just die if I walked in a room and one of my babies was dead. I would certainly blame myself. It's not true. It's not true. It's something that happened with that baby and the baby's mechanisms inside of its body that caused it to die. There's a lot of publicity, and there used to be, like I said, the link of parents being abusive. And you weren't abusive. And this is not shaken baby syndrome. This is not torturing a baby. This is not throwing it down in the crib and breaking its neck. This is an entirely different phenomenon and experience. This is a baby that has been treated well, has been to the doctor, has been seen by third-party independent people that'll say, no, that mom was taking great care of that baby. She's a good mom. We don't know why the baby's dead. And you don't know either as the mother. There hasn't been a lot of promising research in sudden infant. I read, I'm older, and I read everything on sudden infant death in the 70s and 80s. Every study that had ever been done. I even read studies that were translated from Chinese and Japanese and Russian to be able to understand what other countries were doing. These days, I looked up, not too long ago, what was going on. It's much more complex, and I think it's much more to the center of what the truth is. Now, be careful. Be careful of trying to put too much weight on my words. Yeah, I have a master's degree, and yeah, I've studied it. Have I been in the lab? No, I haven't been in the lab. I didn't get any money. I didn't get a grant. But I did a lot of reading and a lot of talking to people who are experts in sensory deprivation, altered states of consciousness, psychology, sociology. I know a lot about family constellations in foreign countries and in America. And I've had 14 children, and now I've had them in cribs, and none of them died. Thank God, none of them died. But I have handled, and I have had terrorizing experiences of waking up in the middle of the night and just feeling the baby's tangled in something, and I go in and sure enough, moms have that all the time. The baby's tangled. Not dead, but tangled. So, there's a lot of competition for grants in this area. And you do get, not a lot, but you do get a few fraudulent scientists, people who lie to get money, people who falsify their statistics and try to make the government and the public believe, oh, he or she's going to get it. They're very, very close. And when you scrutinize and you've got enough education, you see the statistics are skewed, you see that the studies were not random, you see that basically the scientists didn't have the credentials, and you just see crap. And that happens in, I think, all areas of science, but it does happen in sudden infant death too. Now, here's where I'm going to go, and the reason that I'm doing this video is twofold. If I can help parents understand it is not their fault, it is something that is physiological with the child, and the parents had nothing to do with it, not training the child or not covering it up enough, or the food was bad or had an allergic reaction. It's none of that. It's an independent event that humans don't have control of yet. Now here's where I went, and I'm making this video at the second part of my motivation here, is I just want this on tape. I've had quad bypass surgery. I can fall over while I'm talking to you, and I want it documented that when I was younger and in school, I came up after reading all of the scientific journals, abstracts, etc., with a theory. I think I know why and what sudden infant death is. Now, does that mean that you should believe me no matter what he said? He has agreed. No, no, no. A theory is only a theory if it has not been tested for the null hypothesis, which means you take a theory and you try to disprove it. You don't try to prove a theory. A good scientist always goes to the null hypothesis, which means the theory sucks. It doesn't fit the numbers and what happens to a baby. So please, let me over and over say how cautious you should be. But it might be true. It just might be true, because they haven't found it. And they're moving now towards the area that I said 30 years ago where it was. Okay, here's what led me to my theory. They die in the dark, usually. Not always. I told you some will die, a few, not very many. Good Lord, I think it's less than 1% in the daylight when they're sleeping. So they die at night. They die when they're sleeping. They die in the dark. They die alone. Generally, there's no one else in the room. Now, I've read a couple of studies out of thousands that a mother was holding a baby and it died of SIDS. Yes, no, I don't know. We know it dies more in the winter. We know it dies more in certain cultures. And any theory that has any kind of validity has to account. Why are they dying in the winter? Why don't they die in Asia as much? Why do the American Indians have the highest rate of sudden infant death? So I took all of the things we do know about sudden infant and I said, this theory has to fit in here. You can't just throw one out because it's inconvenient. That's not a real scientist. A real scientist takes legitimate studies that fortify and support the theory and then cohesively tries to put a theory together. What's happening to these innocent, poor little kids? Well, I came across phenomenons that were unusual in adults. And then I began to say, I wonder if this goes on with babies. Now, if you've got a baby, you know it does. One of the things I'm talking about is apnea, A-P-E-N-A. That's when a human being is asleep and suddenly they just quit breathing for no reason. Your husband or your wife, you may have seen this, or a child, and they quit breathing. And most of the time, in a few seconds, maybe 10, 12 seconds, 15 seconds even, they'll pick up. respiration. Again, I said, what causes apnea? Well, we know a little bit about that. I had an operation that cut out the back of the little thing that hangs in the back of your throat. I can't think of what the name of it is now. Go look on the internet. They cut it out, and I didn't have apnea anymore. Well, that was a good thing. Is that the only cause of apnea? I don't think so, but it did help me. It's kind of like snoring. You know, if you have a certain operation on your nose and you don't snore anymore, does that mean that's the problem with every snore? Of course not. It means it was that one. So, apnea, I saw as an adult, and I experienced as an adult. And when I quit breathing, I would lay there for a few seconds, asleep, and then suddenly, bam, startled. We call it a startled response. I come wide awake. I go, oh, what the hell was going on there? And then you go back to sleep, and it doesn't happen for another week or month or whatever it is. So I knew that apnea probably had something to do with sudden infant death. But what? What? We also found out that when we were able to measure brain waves, they always die in REM sleep. That is the rapid eye movement part of the sleep cycle, which is dreaming. They always die dreaming. How is this all going to jibble and jumble together? The other thing is that the boys, they die more than the girls. What's wrong with the boy's body? Why is it more defective? Why is it having these deaths, and they're really no different than the girls' bodies? That has to fit in. You can't just throw out pieces of a theory you don't like. Scientists who are good scientists have made these studies, and the statistics are hard, the randomness is hard, the validity is there, and you can't just put that underneath the bed and then try to go get another grant. Many do, and I never did. I never did. I've talked to parents who've lost children. I've done studies on that, and I've talked to a pathologist, and he's done many SIDS autopsies. He says the same thing. David, there is no cause of death. This is a healthy infant, and it just died. We don't know why. I've certainly been in contact in my earlier days with current researchers that when I proposed my theory, it looked like maybe they would have grant money taken away and somebody might take my theory, and you know, so they were hostile. Some of them are really hostile and ignorant. You don't want to take money away from the scientists. That's how they pay the bills. So when I looked at all of these theories and all these facts, true, hard facts, I started to think a little bit in the areas of sensory deprivation. Okay? Now why? Why would that make any kind of a connection in my mind? Okay, I'm going to share something, and when I do this, you'll take the camera and throw it out the window, and I don't really give a rat's ass. Because it's the truth, and it's the truth, and I've never said anything on any of my videos that have purposely been a lie. I'm sure that I've quoted dates or times or names incorrectly, and that's okay with me, because I don't really care again. But the truth, or the substance of what I'm saying, is true. When I was 12, a young boy, I had a couple of experiences, okay? And I don't know what, and I don't know why. And boy, I have argued and argued back and forth. I'm an atheist now. I was a Christian then. And I read every study again on sensory deprivation. And it led me to McGill University in Canada, where they paid students, I think, $5 a day to lay in a cardboard box with cotton and silence all around them in the dark, and to see how that is going to affect a human being. Of course, there's been a lot of other studies done on sensory deprivation. Well, it's interesting. The people who were having serious sensory deprivation were having what we call now, and again, this is controversial, this is not something that we've been able to measure yet and factually prop up, out-of-body experiences. You may hear it too as astral projection. This, in short, is where the spirit body, if you want to call it that, if it's a spirit or whatever, your mind, I don't know. And boy, people have argued with me back on this, back and forth. But I was laying flat on the bed, and suddenly I began to rise spiritually, some kind of another consciousness or body out of my physical body, and I was still laying flat, and I could look back on my bed and see my physical body. Yeah, am I crazy? Well, I thought so. I thought so for many years until I realized that about 1 in 100 people have that experience, out-of-body experiences. Now, what does it mean? Some of my hardcore atheist friends says it's your mind, it's a hallucination. My Christian friends say, well, you have a spirit body and you have a physical body, and your spirit came out. Well, what's the truth? I don't know. I don't know. But I do know this. There's a couple of phrases in the King James Bible that I can't discount because it fits into some of this theory. One of them is Paul. Paul said, and look in your Bible, I'm not going to look that up and put it in front of the camera, I don't have the interest. Paul said, when he was having a revelation, whether in the body or out, I could not tell. That's an interesting phrase, because if you've had astral projection experiences, that's what I would say. Whether I was in the body or out, I could not tell, but I could look back and see my body. Ecclesiastes, I think 13, is talking about death. And it says something like, I'm paraphrasing, when the cystine, or if ever the silver cord be cut, the body returns to dust and death, and it is not able to be sustained or something. Look up Ecclesiastes. I have for years and years. You look it up. I couldn't discount that because about 40% of the people that I've read, thousands of out-of-body experiences of other human beings, they saw a cord, a silver or a white cord that ran from the base of the head, the pineal gland, evidently, according to, what's his name, Fox, I think, to the spiritual body. And there was an instinct in the spiritual body that was outside that if that became cut or tangled or broken, they weren't going back. They weren't going back. Now, how does an atheist explain all this now? It was easier to explain as a Christian because, you know, we think we're going to die and off we go to heaven and our spirit goes on and our body goes into the ground. I'm just going to tell you the facts, and then you can decide your own, you know, moral philosophy. That's up to you. I continue to have those experiences in my freshman year, from 12 years old on up to my freshman year at BYU. And I always noticed now, over a period of years, some things that I didn't notice at the beginning, and I learned a lot about out-of-body experiences. I read incessantly. Oliver Fox, that's the man that has got extensive research in, he's dead and his book is out of print, but he's good, he's good. I noticed that when I traveled between Brigham Young University and my home in California, I'd drive straight through. That's 12 hours. And when I got there, you know, I would play with my parents and not really sleep, and then I might get, whatever, 7 hours of sleep and turn around and drive all the back to BYU. I noticed that when I was dead tired, that the experiences of out-of-body were more frequent. I thought, what the hell does that have to do with out-of-body experiences when I'm exhausted and when I haven't slept? I have sleep deprivation. Well, that led me to starting to look at phenomena of what happens to your physical body when you don't get enough sleep. I mean serious sleep, where you've been up for 2 days, 3 days. And I began to see again apnea. I began to see again people reporting out-of-body experiences. And I began to see some correlation between sensory deprivation and sleep deprivation. And then I began to see that the REM section of sleep, the rapid eye movement dream cycle, was extremely active, extremely, right to the point of hallucinations. What would that have to do with sudden infant death? Well, I twisted and turned and tried to take a look at the facts of dying too much in the winter and cultural facts and whatever, and I had to start to fit together all of this information and come up with some kind of a cohesive theory. What is making these babies die? And explaining all of the facts. Well, this could take hours and hours to explain, and I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go on record of saying what my theory is. Here's my theory in a nutshell, much more complex. When we go to bed at night, these are facts, we know that our breathing is run from our brain. Our brain continues to make us breathe. When we go into REM sleep, the brain isn't doing it anymore. It's the medulla, which is the bottom of the spine. It picks up respiration. The brain goes into REM sleep and starts to dream. And evidently it doesn't have room to keep the breathing going and dream, so it turns it over to the medulla, and the medulla then breathes for the human that is asleep. Now, we also know that when that happens, the human becomes paralyzed from the neck down. They may be dreaming about running outside or falling or flying, but their body is really frozen so that they don't get hurt during the dream cycle. Now, you've heard of people that walk in their sleep or whatever, but they're not in REM. They're in other stages of the sleep cycle. So, I began to start to think there's some correlations here. There's some things that do fit together. Now, I've noticed apnea seems to have something to do with that switching mechanism between the brain and the medulla. That's all done through the nervous system and up the spine, and when the brain goes, hey, I'm going to dream, you take over the breathing, and the medulla says, okay, I'm going to do that. What if the brain says, okay, I'm going to start dreaming, and you take over the breathing, and the medulla says, I'm too busy, I'm not going to do it. Or I didn't hear you, it wasn't clear to me what you were doing and when you were doing it. Now, you got a problem. The baby stops breathing. But in apnea, I've found that, speaking of the event, it's a startled response. When you wake up from an apnea, it's a startled response, and it brings you to a conscious level, and it resets the brain. I thought, well, what if the medulla didn't hear it well or at all, and the breathing stops? Apnea should bring that startled response, and the baby should be fine in the morning. It's just a cycle. Okay? What if the startled response isn't there? What if the baby quits breathing? It hasn't suffocated. That makes the lungs look very different. They're strained because of no oxygen. The baby was totally breathing, and the brain sent off the signal for the medulla to take over. It didn't. The baby stops breathing. It's the emergency mechanism in human beings that we're startled, and we bring ourselves to a state of consciousness, and the brain resets. That's what I think is causing sudden infant death. The startled response is not there. Now, what do you do? It's easy to make stuff up like that, but how does it fit with sensory deprivation, apnea? How does it fit with more death in the winter time? You got to fit that stuff in, or it's crap. It may be fun and flowery and, oh gee, he's got it, but no, you've got to fit the facts in if you're a real scientist, and you can't fudge on them. There has to be solid facts and reasons that those facts fit into that theory. Well, again, I'm not here to prove the theory, and I feel very bad that I was never able to do all the research on it. And like I said, I just want to go on record that I think I had it 30 years ago. But when you're a young college student and people are getting money for their research, they're going to ignore you and make fun of you and say, you know, he's crazy. Well, that could be so. All right, let's take a look at sensory deprivation. Okay? Sensory deprivation means that your body is not receiving sound or feeling or smell, the five senses, tactile. You're not feeling that. It may be going on, but you don't feel it. Well, here's my theory and how it fits into that. I think there has to be a reason that they quit dying at 12 months. What happens at 12 months and what happens between the second and fourth month? Okay? The second and fourth month, there is a peak. They die at a greater rate. Well, guess what babies do between the second and fourth month? They develop myopic vision. At first, when a baby is born, it's kind of like a, you know, an owl or whatever, where their eyes can go. They go together, but they can't see depth, and they can't see and focus. Myopic is where the vision comes into a point, and now they can say, oh, I see where the light is. It's 5 feet away. Well, when you don't have myopic vision, it's going to be pretty hard to dream things other than maybe patterns, mathematical. I don't know what a baby dreams about, and neither does anyone else. But that myopic vision develops right there between the second and the fourth month. What would that maybe have to do with sudden infant death? I think it has something to do because now the sensory input has to be increased because it's taxing the system. The sleep system, if you've had a baby, you know damn well that baby is sleeping 2/3 of its life. 2/3 of its life is in the sleep cycle, and some of that is going to be in REM, and they're at risk. So I think the vision does change so that they can look over the balcony and see the trees and see where the doors are, and it focuses, and the dreams become much more vivid. And so when the baby goes into REM sleep, there's plenty of information in the dream area that it can make up dreams, and hallucinations are the last resort. If the baby is running out of dream material from the day, we call it day residue, then maybe hallucinations in the baby are desperately trying to keep that breathing system working. Well, sensory deprivation. Between the second and fourth month, at least I had something. No one else has. At least I had something between that second and fourth month, myopic vision. And I believe that it has something to do with the dream cycle. Babies, when you toss them and play with them and talk to them like moms do and dads, that's putting sensory input into the baby's brain. And when it goes to sleep at night and it clicks over into REM sleep, that information from the day starts to now jumble into dreams. Now, why is that important? Well, I believe, my theory says, the dream cycle is the most dangerous cycle for a baby in 24 hours. Because if you stop dreaming, dreaming is a phenomenon that fools the physical body into thinking it's receiving sensory input. I believe if you stop all sensory input into any human being, they will die. They will die. That's my theory, portions of my theory. They will die if there's not sensory input. So if that little brain can't put together dreams, then the brain is going to say, oh, we got problems here, we got to wake up. So it sends a signal down to the medulla, and the medulla says to the respiratory system, don't breathe. We're going to use the emergency system of apnea and the startled response. So everybody does their job except the startled response. If the startled response is not there neurologically and is not well developed, you're going to walk in the room and find a dead baby with no cause of death. None. Nothing you could have done about it. No way to see it. Now there is a little bit of monitoring these days for apnea especially. They can see some babies, not very many, but some babies are prone to apnea and appear to be at a higher risk for sudden infant death. But no one has the entire theory pulled together. So, The baby is played with. It uses the day residue to dream, and if it runs out of dreams at night, it triggers, the brain triggers the medulla stops the respiration, and the startled response from apnea is supposed to wake that baby. It doesn't. Now, how do the other facts fit into this theory? Why would, we've said that they peak at the second and fourth month. Gotta explain that. I say it's myopic vision. They're sleeping more and more, they're taxing that system, and damn, it better work. It better work. And when it doesn't work between the second and fourth months, there's a lot of developmental things that go on there. Then you're going to get a peak in the phenomena statistics. Now, why the boys? Gotta fit. Can't throw it out. Can't throw it out. Why the boys? Well, something we know about neonate and development, early development of children, especially in the womb and the first few weeks and months of birth, that their nervous system is not well developed. It's not. There's times that the reason you circumcise babies, when they're 1 day or 2 days old is, yeah, they'll cry, but it's not like they're an adult. They don't feel it as much as an adult would feel it because the nerves are not there to the brain well developed. Now, what makes a nerve well developed? It's called myelination. It's like an electrical wire. If you just have a copper wire and you put electricity on this end and on this end, it will go through. But if you touch that wire anywhere in between, if it's not covered, you're going to get the shock and the electricity is not going to get all the way to the other end. So what do? Myelination. We cover that wire with cord, plastic cord. Now, the electricity can't jump out. It goes from here over to here. Again, that's my theory. The myelination of those nerves is not well developed. So the medulla may send off a message over here, hey, we need the startled response. Apnea gets that, but the myelination to the nerves going to the apnea startled response aren't well developed. And the signal falls off through the body, and you get no startled response. So I think that myelination has a lot to do with sudden infant death. And I believe that some of the reason that it doesn't happen after 12 months is the baby's neurological system is well developed. The myelination is all over all of the nerves, and the synapses get all of the information in the brain, and the chemical reaction across the brain is fully developed. And now, why don't they die after 12 months? Well, I gave you one reason there. The myelination and the brains are working much more efficiently at that point. What else happens at 12 months in a child's life? They begin to babble. They begin to start to try to make words. They begin to go, baba, means a bottle, mama, dad. They begin development, okay? Abstract thought. To this point in a child's life, they can't think abstractly. When they saw a bottle at 7 months, they wouldn't go, baba. They couldn't. They're not developed that far. And they saw it before the fourth or third month. They couldn't focus in on, oh, baba. All they were seeing the whole landscape. I think that language stops sudden infant death. And the reason it stops sudden infant death is that you can think infinitely for the first time in your life. You can hallucinate, and the brain can stay alive during REM sleep, even if it's out of dream material. Now you can have babas floating through the air, mommy running with the baba, and mommy crying and coming to you when you cry for the baba. Suddenly now you have abstract thought as an infant, and sudden infant death lost all its power. It used to be on day residue. Every day you poured that information in a baby. Now you don't have to. It's in the conscious and subconscious areas of the brain that cause the dream cycle, and the baby now is safe from sudden infant death. Okay, now, why the winter months? It's going to fit in. It's a fact. Why do they die more in winter months? I lived in Massachusetts, in Berkshire, Massachusetts, western, and boy, we had snow unbelievable. Covered the roofs of the houses. We had babies. You know what you do in Massachusetts with a baby? You put on a snowsuit. You put on a hat. You put on gloves. And all there is a baby in a box like at McGill University with a little face coming out, and they can't turn left and right and see crap. Okay? Does that cut down on their sensory day input? You bet your ass it does. I think that's why they die in the winter months more, because their sensory deprivation is impeded because we have to keep the baby warm and we have to keep it from freezing to death, and we don't know that we're destroying its sensory input for the day. That to me explains winter weather and winter months. Okay, now culturally, why would the Asian and those cultures be far different than the American Indian? And we also know that poor black mothers in ghetto areas also have a higher rate of sudden infant death. Well, let's take a look at the sensory input. If you've ever lived in the Philippines or other Asian countries, you may have 8 or 10 people living in one room. When Boo-Boo cries and wakes everybody else up, someone's going to pick up Boo-Boo and say, oh, come on over here, and they're going to pass it from person to person to person. And they're also in tropical climates where the baby in the daytime just has a diaper on and all of its skin and tactile input. Everyone's playing with the baby. They're patting it to children. Children are poking its eyes. It has more stimulation than it knows what to do with. So the day residue in that society is very, very heavy. They don't die as much. That explains it to me. Now, what about the Native American? Why are they having the highest incidence of sudden infant death? Well, have you ever seen a papoose? You put a baby in a papoose like this, what's it going to feel? It can't move, it can't explore, it can't use its fingers. There's no toys to play with on the floor because it's on the mother's back, and the baby can only look one way, backwards, and there's less sensory input in a tribal society. When you live in a tent, it's not quite as much stimulation as a house with a ceiling fan and clocks and skylights and music and radios. There's a lot of sensory deprivation in the Native American lifestyle. There's also in the Native American lifestyle a long, long history that little boys are more valuable than little girls because boys can hunt and they can feed the tribe. Girls aren't worth shit. And there's a lot of you know what word I'm trying to say. There's a lot of purposeful death in the American Indian tribes where they'll put a girl out, you know, and the coyotes will eat her or she'll freeze to death, and that's no big deal because the boys are kept at a much higher rate. And so maybe that attitude and maybe that value system causes more sudden infant death. You don't pick babies up as much. You don't talk to them. You don't play with them if they're female. And the boys are more prized. Now, why the black mothers down in the ghettos? Well, I've never been a black mother, but I do know, I've worked in ghettos, and I do know that those mothers try to work. The babies are left alone a lot with siblings, and sometimes left alone a lot laying in a crib for an hour, 2 or 3 hours. And there's not a lot of stimulation there. We also know that smokers, they seem to have a higher rate of sudden infant death too. Is it the smoke? I don't think so. I think it's the sensory deprivation. They're sitting in front of the TV smoking and drinking and watching TV, and Boo-Boo is yelling in the back, and they go, ah, screw Boo-Boo. I'm half drunk and I'm taking drugs, and Boo-Boo can handle herself. I think that sensory deprivation in poverty areas, and because the blacks are the most impoverished in our country because we discriminate against them, that statistic pops up there a little bit. So, now I'm sitting here thinking, have I covered the winter months? Yes. Have I covered boys and girls? No, I didn't cover why are boys more inclined in the 12-month period to die more. Well, let me tell you, because I do have a degree in child development. Boys don't develop as quickly as girls. If myelination of the nerves is a large part of sudden infant death because you're losing the electrical current into the body, it's being dissipated rather than passing from the brain to the medulla quick and sharply, boys don't develop. They talk later, they walk later, and until they're about 7th, 8th, 9th grade, right in there, the girls are smarter. The girls have greater manual dexterity, and the girls are bigger. I think the boys are more at risk because they're not as developed neurologically as the girls. That fits with what I know, and I think it fits with science. So I've got the winter months, I've got the cultures, I've got the boys higher, I've got the 2nd and 4th month myelination, I've got the sleep cycle, I have REM, I've got apnea, and I've got the startled response, and without that startled response, you're going to get a dead baby that quit breathing because the brain is out of day residue. After the 12th month, I've got that too. They develop language. And now they have abstract thought, and abstract thought can be churned and twisted and turned infinitely. It's called a hallucination. The body thinks it's getting sensory input. And so that's my theory of sudden infant death. And if I had more time, I've given this lecture at certainly many places. And I always like to handle questions, and obviously you can't come through the camera and say, this is my question. But you can go to the internet. You can look at the medical abstracts. Look up the myelination of young neonate children. Take a look at some of the things I've said. Maybe they make sense to you, maybe they don't. But please, let me leave you with the pure knowledge that we know these children are not abused. They're not kicked, they're not thrown in bed, they're not in any way abused. They've usually seen a doctor. They've usually seen a doctor, okay? Now, if they've seen a doctor and they're dying at a higher rate, that's got to fit in. It's got to fit. You can't just go, oh, well, the doctor means nothing. That's not a real theory. So, I have to handle the doctor. Babies that die